All right, welcome back to the House Environment Committee. We are going to continue testimony on H727 with Billy Coster from the Agency of Natural Resources. Welcome.
Thank you. Good morning and thanks for having us. For the record, my name is Billy Coster. I'm the Director of Planning and Policy for the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources. And first want to thank your committee and others in the House for your attention to data centers and their potential natural resource impacts in Vermont. You know, this is an important issue that and a concern that we share. So great to see the conversation started. First want to say, you know, fortunately, unlike many other states where we're seeing an explosion in data center development, Vermont has an extremely robust framework of existing environmental and state land use laws. So we're in very good shape compared to some of these other jurisdictions to address any impacts associated with these facilities. I had testified in the House Energy and Digital Infrastructure Committee before town meeting week that at this point, from our agency's perspective, we feel that our existing regulatory oversight of potential impacts from data centers paired with Act 250 review and their very broad criteria related to water and air quality would largely be sufficient to address impacts associated with these facilities. At that time, I pointed out a potential gap in that approach, however, that there could be a data center proposed on say a 9-acre parcel in a 10-acre town that would not trigger Act 250. And at that point, I suggested that an explicit Act 250 trigger for any data centers of whatever scale you determine appropriate be added. And I see in this new draft, there is a trigger that explicitly does that. So again, you know, from our perspective, we don't see massive gaps in oversight between our existing programs and Act 250, but we're happy to be told otherwise. And if there's legitimate concerns and evidence where our existing framework is insufficient, we're certainly happy to look at those programs and suggest back revisions that would fill those gaps so that there is no risk to our environment going forward. This new draft, I think, intends to address some of those perceived gaps in section 286, which begins on page 9. I believe it's entitled Water Use, Cooling, Permitting, Quality. You know, our interpretation of this, and I apologize, just saw it late yesterday, is what it attempts to do is require for data centers that it obtains certain permits from our agency that other forms of development with the same impacts wouldn't be required to obtain. So the idea here is that even if a data center doesn't hit the jurisdictional trigger for groundwater withdrawal permit or for a water quality certification, it would still need to obtain one from our agency. While again, we're committed to identifying and filling gaps, we don't think this approach is maybe the best approach for a couple of reasons. First, early indications is that there would need to be other conforming changes in statute under those two programs to basically change their jurisdiction to take oversight of these facilities. Our lawyers say that it would be hard to just direct them to obtain a permit that they're actually not otherwise required to obtain in law. So that can certainly be fixed through additional legislation, but wanted to flag that for you.
All right, can you go back to the reference in the bill?
Yeah, so this is section 286. It starts on page 9. And when you get down to subsection C and E, it basically directs data centers to obtain certain permits. Especially in section C, it explicitly says, even if that permit's not necessary or isn't, you know, you're not meeting the jurisdictional threshold to trigger that permit. So, you know, I spoke briefly with, you know, one of the proponents of this idea just before coming on. And I think the intent is that these permit programs offer a review of issues that are maybe unique and novel to data centers, and that could add some value to the overall oversight. And if that's true, we're fine to figure out the best way to do it. Just the way that it's proposed here raises just some questions and some concerns, and could result in us having to undertake, you know, fairly robust regulatory proceedings that take staff time, public time for something where there is no actual issue to be regulated. And I guess the other thing I'd share is if there are concerns that data centers present and there's gaps, we should be talking about those for any sort of land use, not just this specific thing. If a new technology emerges that has the potential for the same environmental impact, we should be looking at that too, not just for data centers. So there's kind of a fairness and good governance component there as well. So, long story short, we think existing A&R regulations paired with Act 250 is likely sufficient to address these concerns. If there are gaps, we're absolutely willing to hear more about them and figure out how and if our program should be updated to address them. But the way that this section is currently structured raises some concerns. I think as Mr. Poor indicated, given the time, if this is where it needs to be to kind of move it through the process, there is time in the second half of the biennium to deal in or the session to dial in some of these issues. Last thing I'll just point out is subsection F in that section requires a PFAS monitoring plan if data centers discharge wastewater into surface waters. Just want to note that the state does not currently have a surface water standard for PFAS. So if there were a monitoring requirement, we wouldn't have a standard to hold them or enforce them to. So just another piece that would need to be tied down a bit if this was your intent.
When will we have that surface water standard?
I don't know. But John might know, but I don't know where that's at. Certainly could get back to you on it.
Thank you. I want to summarize. That caught my attention yesterday, this section of these permits and your reading of it is, this is saying these permits could be required even if they wouldn't otherwise have been required of another type of similar development.
Yes.
So that seems like something to work out. Are you going to be able to help?
Sure, we could.
Language to work that out.
Yeah, I guess my first question would be, if you believe that existing permits and Act 250 oversight is not sufficient and there may need to be more, then we can certainly provide a path to get there. But that's, I guess, a threshold question for us. And I think you'll hear from Mr. Grodman that he believes there are some gaps. So you may conclude the answer is yes.
We've heard from him first. No, it's good. Representative Chapin.
Thanks, Liz. This is really helpful. I guess we've been specifically asked to think about PFAS in our committee versus the energy. So I'm just, and we've PFAS in other ways. I guess particularly I'm curious with your suggestion that we think about why we would ask a permit program to cover something that's otherwise not jurisdictional. I'm thinking about technology or development that uses this massive amount of water. And then what seems maybe particular to data centers is how coolant gets added to that water. And you have this massive amount of coolant, which is in just my very tiny limited knowledge, like usually coolant isn't added to that kind of massive amount of water as far as I'm concerned. So you get to deal with coolant in a very specific way for disposal versus in this, when we have this massive water, where is it going to go when it does get discharged either during or at the end of the life cycle or something. So I guess I'm curious if you have any idea of any kind of similar development or technology that does utilize water in this sort of massive way, or in a closed loop system, and then ultimately at some point has to get discharged, or some of these I presume are drawing water much more regularly.
I don't off the top of my head. I can certainly confer with the folks who run the programs that regulate these sorts of facilities. We certainly do look at a range of pollutants in wastewater discharges and surface water. We may look at PFAS. My point is more that there's not a surface water standard. We've been primarily concerned with groundwater due to the health risks from consuming that water. There's not as many surface water sources. So again, these are likely very legitimate concerns. Just asking people to get permits when they're otherwise not required was my main concern. So we can get back to you with some suggestions of how to address these concerns in a way that makes more sense from our perspective.
Great, thanks. Further questions for Mr. Coster, Representative Austin?
Does the region have surface water standards like Maine, any waters that come through Vermont, Canada, New York? Would they be
I literally was alerted of our lack of a surface water standard about 5 minutes before I walked in the room. So I can't speak to it, but I can certainly have the folks with expertise in our agency answer that question.
Anything
for you.
that come
And
into
John
Vermont.
may know.
Yeah, well, we're supposed to have one. Yeah. Okay, final questions. We will let you, like, yeah, thank you. That's great.
Thank you.
John Groveman.
Morning. Thanks for the opportunity to testify about this bill. For the record, I'm John Groveman. I'm Policy and Water Program Director for the Vermont Natural Resources Council. So I watched most of Michael Grady's testimony, and he covers some of this, but just, it seems like you already understand the context for the bill, but just before I get into the specifics of it, I'm really glad that the committee is taking this up and that the House Energy Committee has drafted a bill. This is a really serious issue, as Representative Chapin was just alluding to. I'm going to focus on the water parts of the bill, and by talking about Act 250, other environmental impacts, but the rate at the development of these data centers and the environmental impacts they cause is really significant and really concerning. The projection from experts that look at the data center development are projecting a doubling of data centers by 2030 across the country. And a lot of the focus now has been in states like Virginia and some other of the mid-Atlantic states, but this is real. Obviously, we all read the news and know that AI is just a major driver of our economy right now. So this is happening. And from a water perspective, to Representative Chapin's question, I don't know. I mean, the type of, the estimates that I've seen is like smaller data centers using 300,000 gallons of water per day to cool the facility. So as you've heard from Michael Grady and others, cooling is necessary for these data centers. So that's a small data center. It could be up to 5 million gallons of water per day. So these are impacts that, we certainly have never seen in Vermont. And I think around the country, people haven't seen. And it's, a major reason for the concern about the siting of these facilities. So I do think that even though Vermont does have some good mechanisms in place, that there are some gaps, and I'll talk about those. So the cooling of the water, data centers, they use water to cool facilities either from surface water, so just taking it right out of mostly a larger river, or it could be a lake, groundwater, or from public water supplies. It seems around the country they've used a lot of water from public water supplies. And I don't see that happening in Vermont because we just don't have that many large public water supplies. Like we obviously have Lake Champlain, which is the water supply for most Vermonters actually by percentage. So you could put one of these in Burlington, and I guess you could, there are, I don't think that our Vermont's larger cities that get its water from Lake Champlain, Burlington, South Burlington, all the Chittenden County towns, I don't think they'd be super excited about like giving the water that they have a permit for from ANR to use for drinking water, to just give it to a data center, for cooling. But so given that, they could just take the water from Lake Champlain, or we have direct experience with taking water from surface waters for cooling, and that's Vermont Yankee. So we have a lot of experience. We had decades of experience. And Vermont Yankee, that needed to cool down its nuclear facility, took the water from the Connecticut River. That was a significant issue. And I wanna stress that not only is there a concern about, obviously, if you're taking water from groundwater, really significant issue in terms of the impact on that groundwater aquifer and other people being served by that aquifer. And that's why in 2008, I think we created this groundwater withdrawal permit program, and we declared groundwater a public trust resource. So I think Vermont has been it's one of those issues where I think Vermont has been a leader in the environment and really thinking forwardly, saying, hey, surface water is a public trust resource federally. It is via a Supreme Court decision from over 100 years ago, but groundwater is not inherent legally a public trust resource. Vermont and New Hampshire, I think, are the only two states that have declared groundwater to be a public trust resource. And what that means is that the state has obligation to manage the taking of groundwater in what's in the best interest of all Vermonters. And what we said in creating the groundwater withdrawal permit program is that if you can meet these very strict permit standards, and they are very strict, and as Mike O'Grady said, it's if you're withdrawing more than 50, I think it's 56,700 gallons per day, that's the trigger for the groundwater permit, that could cause concerns. And for other users of groundwater, and the state should look at impacts on other users of the aquifer, impacts on surface water, because groundwater and surface water is hydrologically connected, and a whole host of other issues. And so that permit would be needed for a facility that was withdrawing at least 56,700 gallons per day, and it would be hard to get. So I think that is something that I don't think we've had one of those permits issued since we created that program. And that program was at the time in 2008, the concern was water bottling. I don't know if people can remember back to like Vermont Pure and all the concerns about water bottling, but it exists for all kind of commercial activities. The bill does state, as Mr. Coster noted, it basically, and maybe it's not needed because, as I said, a small one of these facilities is going to use 300,000 gallons per day of water. But the way the bill was written was like, why don't we just say they just have to get this permit, and that was the intent. I don't know that that's needed because I said, I think that they'll easily meet the 57,600 gallons per day threshold. So that is that permit program. And that's why, the bill is drafted basically says any withdrawal of groundwater would have to go through that program. But surface water is probably a more likely candidate because I think it would be very hard to get the groundwater permit and to find a groundwater source that would provide enough water to cool the facility. And with Vermont Yankee, I just want to stress that the impacts of both withdrawing the water and then discharging that hot water back into the surface water are significant. They're not just mild impacts. We wrangled with Vermont Yankee and then Entergy Vermont Yankee for their whole history in terms of the impact of that hot water discharge in the Connecticut River. And David Dean, who was the chair of the former House Fish, Wildlife, and Water Committee, was at the tip of that spear. And the impacts on fish habitat were significant. And it's not just at the discharge point. The debate about Vermont Yankee was these heated discharges create what's called a thermal plume. So it's just a plume of hot water that just moves down the river. And then the experts have to model, like, how far is that plume moving? There's no question when that water comes out hot. We're cold water fisheries in Vermont, obviously. So the cold water fish, they respond very negatively to that burst of hot water, and it kills them. And in the Connecticut River, shad was sort of the species of sort of concern. It was sort of the canary in the coal mine species there. And the shad population there was decimated. And the only debate was how far down. And you do need a Clean Water Act discharge permit, which are called NPDES permits, National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permits for the thermal discharge. Thermal pollution is listed in the Clean Water Act as pollution that has to be addressed. And it's in our water quality standards because we're delegated authority under the Clean Water Act to implement that program. But we have a lot of experience with this. And so any of these facilities coming in would have to address this discharge of hot water and get that permit. This is why the bill, I think, really, a provision in here that I think is really, a smart provision is really encouraging, more than encouraging, saying you have to use this closed loop system unless it's not feasible. And the idea is that if you're kind of taking water from whatever your source and you're circulating it and reusing it, it's going to minimize the amount of water you need to take, and it would minimize the amount of water that gets discharged. It would not eliminate the need to withdraw water. There's evaporation, there's a loss of water in the system. I don't know exactly how these closed system works, but from what I read, that's fairly clear about it. So what the bill says now is that you have to use that system unless it's determined that it's not feasible. And that would be essentially the Act 250 Commission under the bill determining that feasibility. So, because I think anything that we can do to minimize the thermal discharge or the withdrawal of water, whether it's from groundwater or surface water, or if it came from a public water supply, it would be essential. And that's sort of the key to, I think, those provisions. And I think what I heard from Mr. Coster is that, ANR is only concerned with that is should you have to get a groundwater withdrawal permit if you're below the threshold. And again, probably not needed, because of the 300,000, because the research indicates that you'd probably exceed that threshold anyway. The other provisions that are in here related to water that Mr. Coster raised, which we could talk a little bit about, have to do with, so in addition to the discharge permit, which would be for thermal pollution, but there could be other pollutants in the discharge that are also in our water quality standards. So the way the Clean Water Act works and our water quality standards work is that we have in our water quality standards a list of pollutants, and we have criteria, limits for those pollutants. And for any of the pollutants that we have listed and those limits, the permit needs to assure that the discharge doesn't exceed those limits. So there are requirements in the permit that you can't exceed those limits. There's very strict monitoring that goes on to make sure you're not exceeding those limits. But there are pollutants that are not listed in the standards that don't show up in that NPDES Clean Water Act discharge permit. And the obvious one is PFAS. So we have not created a standard for any PFAS in our water quality standards. PFAS, as you've heard through your work on other bills, there's a class of chemicals. There's something like 14,000 class of PFAS chemicals. Those are basically perfluorinated chemicals. It's any chemical with fluorine in it, and then there's a subset of chemicals that EPA is focused on that have been the most chemicals that have been monitored and of concern, I guess, mostly in drinking water systems. There's about 40 or 50 of those. And then Vermont and other states have focused on, for drinking water and PFAS and groundwater and PFAS, like about 5 to 10 different PFAS chemicals. I think right now we're up to 5 in Vermont, different compounds. And so, but we have in Vermont a drinking water standard for PFAS, and we have a groundwater standard, but so we don't have one for surface water. This is despite the fact that, and this came up when you looked at the landfill leachate bill, there was a law passed, I don't know, 3, 4, or 5 years ago that required that ANR make a determination about whether it could regulate the whole class of PFAS. That's all the 14,000 approximately PFAS chemicals, both in drinking water standards and in surface water standards. And if it concluded that that was not feasible, that it should at least adopt a surface water standard and a drinking water, groundwater standard for, I think it was 3 to 5 PFAS chemicals. I don't remember. ANR did adopt the standard for drinking water and groundwater, as I said, and actually added chemicals to that list recently, but it never adopted the surface water standard. And it determined that it couldn't regulate the whole class of chemicals. Now, EPA has been sort of, slow to this game. I mean, part of the reason that ANR gave for not regulating the whole class of chemicals was that EPA was not recommending that there wasn't good guidance on how to treat, for the whole class of PFAS, or how to monitor for the whole class of PFAS. VNRC and CLF, we advocated very strongly for the regulating of the class of PFAS. We pointed out in our comments that there is something called a total fluorine test, where you can actually monitor for the whole class pretty easily, and it's not that expensive. But the treatment technologies for PFAS could be expensive, and I think ANR at the end of the day, and you can read it, they submitted a response to the legislature as to why they didn't regulate the class. It was basically, I think, a concern about costs to the water systems in particular. And, you know, they would be doing something that hadn't really been done in the rest of the country. Since that time, EPA has, like I said, I think they're up to 40 or 50 different PFAS chemicals that they basically recommend be monitored for and that be considered by states for regulation through drinking water standards and surface water standards. And at the very end of the Biden administration, EPA issued a document that basically said, listen, we haven't settled on what the standard should be for surface water, but you know, we encourage states, if you think that there are PFAS in discharges that are being made to the waters in your state, that you should regulate those. And there are ways to treat them and there are ways to monitor them, but they didn't recommend a standard. And that's kind of how EPA left it at the end of the Biden administration. Not surprisingly, the Trump administration hasn't really done anything on that. They didn't rescind that, though. They didn't rescind that guidance, but they haven't moved it forward. And, you know, VNRC certainly has talked with the agency a lot. We're concerned that the agency, I think, is a year plus past the deadline for adopting the PFAS surface water quality standard. And, you know, you should have A&R and they could explain why they haven't done it. Our argument basically is that if you think, you know, if A&R thinks it can't do it or the reasons why they can't do it, they should come to the legislature and we should have a debate and we should change the law. Like the law says they should do it right now. And if they have a rationale, and they do, when we don't agree with it, we think that we could and we should regulate certain PFAS in these discharges. Let's have the debate. Let's have the debate out here in the legislature. And if the legislature is convinced, we can modify the law. We can provide resources to do it, whatever. But it's ignoring the law is not acceptable. But that's the status quo. So this gets to the issue of like, why require a water quality permit that's beyond just the discharge permit? This is what Mr. Coster was alluded to. And what he was alluding to is in the bill, and it is all in section 287, I think, that it starts on page 9 of the bill. It basically says, in addition to the discharge permit, in addition to the groundwater withdrawal permit, and a surface water withdrawal permit, which I'll talk about in a second, the applicant should have to get what's known as a water quality certificate. And a water quality certificate is a broader water quality review that's required under the Clean Water Act for projects that require a federal permit or license. So those are usually energy generating projects that need a license from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, like hydroelectric facilities. Vermont Yankee needed a Clean Water Act water quality certificate because they had to get a license from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. We've had biomass facilities over the years that needed to get a water quality certificate because they needed a FERC license as well because they're generating power. But if you're not, and then you could require a water quality certificate if you need a wetlands permit from the Army Corps of Engineers. So those are the sort of classic ways. But we have no idea whether these data centers are going to require an Army Corps wetlands permit. And it's not clear whether they would require a FERC license. They could if they're generating electricity. And this is, you know, the Public Service Department's expertise. And what I've heard listening to testimony over the last week is that they actually might generate electricity. So then they would trigger this water quality certificate requirement. But what the bill says and what we suggested, and again, we really want this bill to move forward. And we're open to working with the agency and talking about the best way to do it. But the reason why we suggested requiring a water quality certificate, even if you didn't have a federal permit or license involved, is because it's a broader water quality review and allows you to review impacts that aren't in the discharge permit, like PFAS, right? As we just discussed, PFAS is not going to be regulated in the discharge permit because we don't have a standard. The agency may conclude that there's a lot of PFAS being used in these data centers. There are going to be discharges. We would like there's a regulatory tool to deal with it through a permit. The water quality certificate would provide that tool. It also, and this is something we learned from Vermont Yankee, we looked at this a lot. Vermont Yankee, like I said, they needed a discharge permit and this water quality certificate because they needed that license from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. We argued, and this is when I worked at A&R, you know, at the very end, when you just, as right before Vermont Yankee closed, and it eventually closed down, and so the kind of shut down. They didn't get any of these permits in the end because they closed down. But we argued there are erosion issues that, you know, go beyond sort of our stormwater permitting. There could be other sort of endangered species issues that are classically dealt with under this water quality certificate, and other pollutants. And Vermont Yankee, that included radioactive pollutants like tritium that were not specifically in the standards either. And looking at the groundwater connection with surface water, which also isn't addressed in the discharge permit. So it is just a helpful tool, we think, that to give the agency the authority to deal with these issues that wouldn't be in that specific discharge permit. So that's why we suggested it. We don't think it's duplicative, and I don't think that other types, you know, my gut is that I don't think it's unfair, because I think this is a really unique, really large type of development and use that raises impacts that other developments and uses don't raise. And, you know, so that's why we suggested it. You could argue, well, under Act 250, the agency could go to the district commission and say, well, you know, we can't address PFAS in our discharge permit. So, you know, but we can go to the Act 250, which is broader. So this is an instance where we often talk about what's the value of Act 250. It's broader. It's a broader umbrella review that brings in issues that are not narrowly in those permits. But our thinking is, well, why make A&R go to Act 250 and ask for that? Why don't give them the authority? They're the technical experts in pollutants like PFAS and other issues, water quality issues that aren't covered in the discharge permit. So why, let's cut out like the middle person in all of this and just let A&R regulate this. And then Act 250 still gets to look at it. Those permits would be rebuttable presumption permits. And then Mike talked about this when he testified. So Act 250 would still get to look at it, but they are 99% of the time they rely on A&R, right? For this. And so we just think it makes sense to give A&R this authority. Again, we don't want to hang this bill up. I mean, there's some haven't had time to talk to A&R about all of these issues. I had a good conversation with Mr. Coster before the testimony, so happy to continue these discussions. But I mean, I just want to provide sort of the rationale for the thinking behind some of the provisions that are in the bill. And similarly, so what's in the bill with regard to PFAS is monitoring. And the way it's written is monitoring for the PFAS that EPA recognizes as the PFAS of concern. So it's not the whole class. It's not the 14,000 approximately. It's about 40 or 50. I think it's the definition in the Toxic Substances Control Act for PFAS, which is a step forward because, as I said, we only regulate in this state five PFAS compounds. So, but we do think if we're going to look at these facilities, why not? And we do think the class approach to regulating PFAS is the right approach. Why not just require the applicant to monitor for all the PFAS that's out there? Send it, let the public know, let A&R know. You can do these total fluorine tests. You can find out if there's PFAS in there. And then that would allow the regulators to respond if they have the regulatory tools to do so. Even though the agency doesn't regulate PFAS through the discharge permit, there are other, whether it's Act 250 or if they had this water quality certification tool, they could have authority to deal with these issues. But we think that this is a good use to use the class approach, because I think we've talked about this when we talked about PFAS. Otherwise, it really is every time you choose 5 or 10 or 30 or 40 PFAS, I mean, because there are thousands of compounds, the chemistry just keeps changing. And you can pick a chemical that's outside the realm of regulation or even monitoring, right? But it's just as dangerous because it has the same, all the research shows that every version of PFAS has the same risks, the health risks and environmental risks. So we can continue to kind of chase down 40 or 50. But I think eventually my prediction is 10 or 20 years from now, we will be dealing with the whole class of PFAS and banning it and regulating it. So this seems like a good place to start to doing something like this.
So can you just
Yeah.
pause for one second?
Yes.
Are you saying you think this is an adequate approach, or are you advocating for the total fluorine test?
Well, we advocated for the class, but the bill requires the 40 or 50, and I understand why, because that's what that's EPA's basically recommendation right now, or how they define PFAS in their TSCA rules. They don't prohibit states from doing it, but I understand why it was chosen. But I just want to give you the other kind of view of how to
Yeah, no,
look at this issue.
appreciate it.
You know, we want to see, I said, I want to see the bill move forward. And whatever happens, we can continue to discuss it as it moves to the Senate and try to figure some of these things out. Anything that we do along the lines of what's in this bill is a step forward, you know, so I want to be really clear about this. This is all really positive, and like, we're just trying to provide the range in a short period of time of options and explain why, you know, the rationale for at least our preference for some of those options, but it's all a step forward. Like, you know, if you choose the definition of PFAS that's in the bill now, step forward, you know. If you don't require the water quality certificate, I mean, I think you're taking a tool away from A&R, but overall, the bill still has added protections, you know, that will help if we have a data center.
All right, so back to the water quality, the 401, you said it can, so it allows the agency flexibility in determining the pollutants that are required to be monitored?
Well, it's not a permit, it's a water quality certificate. So it's basically analysis of like, what are the sort of overall water quality impacts and what's necessary to determine broad compliance with the water quality standards. Where the discharge permit is like, what is being discharged, you know, and what is in the standards for limits, and are those limits being met? It's more of like a command and control kind of permit, which engineers and scientists just focus really narrowly on what's in the discharge and what's in the standards.
Guess I just, right, so the certificate
Yeah,
can allow the agency to account for PFAS. The word can, not shall, require them to. I guess I'm stuck on that. How does the agency decide?
it's based on the facts and circumstances. They would have to look at like, this facility is going to be discharged, it's going to be using PFAS, it's going to be either discharged or, you know, having an impact, you know, and they can go beyond the four corners of the discharge permit and say, the evidence shows us is a concern about PFAS, that even though we don't have a standard a specific standard for our discharge permit, we're concerned about it. We think that if this level of PFAS got into the groundwater and then got into the surface water, or got directly into the surface water, it would have an undue adverse effect on water quality, on aquatic habitat, and they could put a condition in the 401 to deal with that.
Deal with it how though? What does that look like?
Well, like for example, in Vermont Yankee, you know, we were talking about the 401 could have, because we thought the evidence showed that the tritium was getting into groundwater and then the groundwater was getting into the Connecticut River. The agency didn't have authority in the discharge permit to deal with that groundwater discharge, but through the 401, it could. It could basically say, well, because this is going to get into the surface water and it could adversely affect water quality and habitat, they could regulate that groundwater discharge and put requirements in that water quality certificate that they couldn't put in other permits. It was a broader set of a review.
Did it stop the tritium?
Well, they ended up shutting down, so we never got there, but we were talking about what those conditions could be. And we were wrangling with Vermont Yankee about that.
So I'm just trying to understand so someone's applying to do this, we leave the 401 in there, which I think is probably a great idea. I'm not questioning it. I'm just wanting to understand it. And they haven't monitored, or we don't know. They don't know that PFAS.
Yeah, I thought about that actually. I mean, I thought
No.
the bill should like, I mean, there's a bit of a catch-22. I think I think the application should say, what are you using PFAS chemicals like in your processing? Like, I think we do need an upfront list. Certainly with monitoring, you could have a condition that basically says that there's continuing jurisdiction, and if the monitoring shows that there PFAS in the groundwater or surface water, that you could reopen the permit to address the discharge. But I had the same thought that upfront, it would be better if there's a way to understand like what chemicals are using in their processing, so we would know upfront.
Yeah.
That's something I thought about as well
Yes.
as I looked at the bill.
We need to figure that out.
Yeah. So anyway, I mean, this is all I've had all of a week to kind of think about this. I just, on the full disclosure, but, so just trying to identify these gaps and discuss tools, and again, I think most importantly, the bill should move forward. We can continue to try to kind of wrangle with this,
Larry?
but I just wanted to like explain some of the thinking behind it and just acknowledge that we're still in the process of trying to analyze it. And so the only thing I didn't mention, and this is a more minor issue, but if there is a surface water withdrawal to cool the facility, we did create, as you well know, a surface water withdrawal permit requirement a couple of years ago. And so that will be helpful, because we're going to have A&R is developing right now the program, which is going to have a rule and require a permit for these surface water withdrawals. It's not been developed yet. I think the rules are going to come out, I think this summer or fall. So I would hope that they be in place no later than 2027. So, but right now the bill requires one of those permits. Even though it doesn't exist right now. So I'm not sure exactly how that works.
When was that supposed to be done by?
I have to go back and look. I think they're not that far, but they're working on that. Unlike the PFAS issue, it's not like PFAS issue is stalled. A&R is working on that program, and so there's just been I don't even know how much it's been delayed. I have to go back and look, but I do know that the rules are going to come out this summer. I mean, I think, in a way, I feel it's sort of validating, like some of the work that the legislature has done over the last, recently creating that surface water withdrawal permit. So we've thought about it. It's not previously, if you triggered Act 250, you could look at these issues in Act 250, but even A&R didn't have like a set way of like analyzing them, but they will with this rule. And that'd be good, to guide A&R and to guide, anyone who's an applicant, let the public know like what the rationale is. The groundwater withdrawal permit, I think that was really, and not most states don't have that. And like I said, most states don't declare groundwater a public trust resource. So we have some good tools that we put in place over the years that will help us. And we have Act 250, and I am heartened to see Act 250 spoken about with positivity and hope rather than concern. And it shows how powerful Act 250 could be as a positive tool to address concerns like this. So I think I hit on the aspects of the bill that I wanted. I'm happy to answer any questions, or I know I'm also on the list to talk about the other bill, and I don't have very much to say about that, but I could pivot to that if you want me to.
Representative Pritchard.
Thank you. So a couple times mentioned that PFAS is part of the process. So where is it in the process? And I guess, if we already know that it's going to be in the water and there's going to be a discharge problem, why aren't we addressing that immediately?
PFAS generally is just it's like, it's something that's sort of a super lubricant, and like nothing sticks to anything, and so that's why it's good in Teflon pans, but also I think in industrial processes, it just kind of helps the whatever the processes are, like work better. But
you're saying they're doing that right now. Is that what?
Yeah,
you're saying?
they definitely use PFAS. I don't know how much. I don't know which ones, and I don't know exactly how these facilities operate. It's but I think the research shows that there are many up and running, and PFAS has been detected in the discharges and in their operation.
Wouldn't it seem smarter to address the root cause
Yeah, well, as you know, your committee's talked about this a lot. We're continually trying to ban the use of PFAS, as much as we can. So yes, we shouldn't use it in my opinion, but it still is used. It's not banned and you can use it in lots of different ways, and it's very commonly used.
It sounds like this bill is allowing it to be used.
This bill is trying to deal with the byproduct of its use, basically. I'm not a net, if haven't discussed banning use of PFAS in the operation of data centers. I mean, that I certainly wouldn't be opposed to that, but I'm sure you'd get the attention of the data center community, but
All right, so we only have 5 minutes left, so. Did you have a question, Representative Morris?
I have an update.
Yeah, so
Looking to see that.
so do you want me? I don't have much to say. I'm on the agenda for the bill regarding the municipal regulation of agriculture. And I just wanted to be honest that I BNRC hasn't taken a position on this bill. We haven't I've been following it, but we haven't read it carefully. We haven't talked about it internally and taken a position on it. And as you know, I did read when the Supreme Court decision came down that you heard about, that it was always, I've been practicing land use law in Vermont for over 30 years, and I've been on my development review board and planning commission, and before the Supreme Court decision, it was very limited authority of town to regulate any aspect of farm practices that were covered by the required agricultural practices. And then that Supreme Court decision changed that. And I know that, there have been groups, the Agency of Agriculture, VLCT, Rural Vermont, and NOFA have been working to try to respond to that decision and find the appropriate balance. I think you should hear from them. Like, they've been working on it. I just don't feel comfortable, because I haven't been involved with those discussions at all. And I do think it's important, how the legislature decides to narrow that decision. But I'd have to go back to VNRC, and we just haven't been involved with the parties that have been talking about that. And I'll go back to VNRC and we'll talk about it as the bill moves through the legislature. But yeah, I think you should hear from those groups first, certainly. And I can't talk until I really go back to VNRC and see what the position would be.
okay. Fair enough. I was surprised to learn you hadn't been involved in it.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps it's oversight, and but I'll go back. But you'll hear from I know you have on the agenda the groups that have been working on that. So, and I'll follow that.
Great.
So,
Thanks
sorry,
so
I can't be more helpful.
Thanks for your testimony, very helpful.
Yep.
Members, with that, we're bumping up against the noon hour. We will